Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Each year, California cities and counties spend millions of dollars on law enforcement training. With the increasing calls for police reform, law enforcement training is increasingly under the microscope. Are the existing training requirements for police officers effective, relevant, and producing desired results, or are they having the opposite effect? Recently, California's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission issued a report entitled Law Enforcement Training, Identifying What Works for Officers and Communities. Our guest is Little Hoover Commissioner Janna Sidley, the chair of the subcommittee that wrote that report, and she's here to tell us what's in it. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today.
So, the state plays a big role in setting minimum standards for training requirements for police officers. Those requirements are carried out by something called the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards, or POST. How do they come up with the training criteria, and how is it evaluated?
So actually, it's a very good question, and most people probably don't know how this is all done. And if I just may step back for just a minute to talk about the Little Hoover Commission and why we took on this study. Obviously, it's so important to all of our citizens in the state of California to make sure that our policing is done in the proper manner and that the citizens are getting the proper protections that they require. And so we all decided that this was an important topic to look at and to make sure that we are moving in a path that is proper. So with that, the commission undertook this study. We had several panels and hearings. And then we wrote this report based on all of that. So with that, to your exact question, how do people find out and how do the post set up what the requirements are? It's generally set by the state legislature, and the state legislature will legislate different topics and the amount of time that is required for police officers to go into instruction. What we found is that historically it's been, you must have a certain number of hours of training and you must have a certain number of classes, certain types of classes, but very little has been done in terms of the back end and research. Are these classes the correct classes? Is this the right amount of time? And so we took a long look at that and we ultimately have made some recommendations through this report about how these determinations are made and how they should move forward.
One of the things you said in your report is that a lot of law enforcement training is based on intuition. That kind of surprised me, I guess. How could research be applied and used in a way to make the training better?
Well, there's a number of universities and other state programs that look at outcomes for different types of training, and they look at the effect. They will look at an incident. They will go back. They might talk to the police officer. What types of training did you have? What did you feel you didn't have? And so there's been quite a bit of research in this area to determine what would be the best type of training for these law enforcement officers. And generally what we've seen is that a legislator will read something in the newspaper and you will get this intuition, as you point out, about, oh, we should add this, or and we should make these officers take this type of training. And that's not necessarily the correct response, although it's definitely a gut reaction that, I've seen this horrible story in the news. I've got to do something. And,
but it reminds me, it kind of reminds me of the law of unintended consequences, though. So the question is, if this research is going to help law enforcement be more effective, in providing training. Why isn't it happening? Why aren't they looking to the research?
Well, there's a number of reasons why it's not happening. What we found is that, there are currently requirements, legislative requirements about how much time and what classes. So that legislation would have to change. It's also very expensive to work with the different outside, researchers to look at what the outcomes are. There's also a lot of concern, unfortunately, about potential litigation and what that would mean. So there are a number of obstacles to look at the appropriate outcomes. And the Little Hoover Commission, we rarely do this, but in this particular case, we did suggest that the legislators put more money into post, and that we also did something extraordinary. We asked the legislature to take a 2-year moratorium
Yeah,
on
I
passing.
noticed that. Yes, just hold on for a minute.
Right.
Yeah.
There are, so as we have been seeing, and we did see this through our study, that there's been an enormous increase in the amount of requirements that legislators have put on law enforcement and different training. And, we need to know if it's the correct training. Our law enforcement officers are to be respected. It is a very difficult job. It is a very important job. And we have an opportunity and also a requirement to help the different organizations do the best work that they can. And the best work that they
Yeah,
can
I
is
did notice. I did
proper
notice
training.
that was very interesting about the legislature taking a little bit of a moratorium. You're also talking about incorporating outcomes from law enforcement training evaluations, collecting and securing data, having an academic review board. So a number of recommendations. When we come back, we're going to take a close look at the current state of police training in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. Recently, California's nonpartisan Little Hoover Commission issued a report entitled Law Enforcement Training, Identifying What Works for Officers and Communities. We're talking with a commission member, Janna Sidley, who chaired the subcommittee that actually wrote that report. There are 41 basic training academies in California, but there's been no overall assessment of who's doing a good job and who isn't. So, Janna, I want to ask you, if we look at some of the major differences in police training, how it's currently being conducted. You've got situations where some kind of focus on stress training, some non-stress, some focus, kind of a paramilitary versus more of an academic classroom setting. Others, the format's different where they actually do a classroom versus experiential training. What works best?
Well, that is actually the important question. And we don't have any full data of what works best. We've talked to many police chiefs. They are very interested in seeing what that data would be in order to determine what is the best path forward. And that is exactly what the Little Hoover Commission recommended, that we want to see data so that we can understand what works best and provide our law enforcement officers with the best opportunity and the best training.
Yeah, it does seem pretty amazing that they're doing these different things. It's basically on intuition. Gee, we think classroom works best, or gee, we think experiential, put them out in the field and have them try it out works best, but they really don't know. And so what you're asking for, it seems to me pretty obvious. It's kind of that feedback loop evaluation. Hey, is this actually working? Is it doing what we intend it to do? So that's part of your 41 recommendations, or the recommendations regarding these 41 current police training academies. Let me ask you another question. Some have suggested that early entry level training doesn't always line up with the knowledge and skills that new officers really need. Can you describe some of the training that new officers receive?
Well, yes. I mean, new officers will receive training in driving, weapons work, various interactions with people. There's, I believe, 11 different sections that the new officers are required to take in their basic training. What we've also seen is that you'll see the same training repeated in for older officers, and that needs to change as well. The training needs to change relative to how many years officers are on the job. And so that is part of the study that we're also recommending. How much actual driving experience do they need? How much, when you talk about stress versus non-stress, are we overtraining for the stressful situation so that officers don't know what to do to ease that stress and actually lower the risk of certain situations? So those are all things that the Little Hoover Commission is suggesting, that we get more data with academics to get the proper training out to the law enforcement officers.
I will say, I was reading your report, and I noted that the post that the training group has 18 core competencies when it comes to field training, and one of them, frankly, is report writing. And I don't think I handle cases as labor management arbitrator, or when police disciplinary cases come before me. That report writing is a pretty important part of the job. As a footnote, I noticed that in your report. I said, yeah, that is actually something you need to train people on. Not everyone knows how to write a report and get all the information down. And if they don't do it correctly, you're not going to get a conviction, which is, if someone's been arrested, and they're guilty.
As a former prosecutor, I couldn't agree with you more. I've read reports and you're like, well, wait a minute, what actually happened? So,
and particularly if there's a disconnect between the police camera and the report, that's really problematic. So let me ask you this, what are some of the challenges to creating better entry-level police training?
The challenges are the same that I spoke of earlier. We need to include data research. We need to provide more money to training. We need to look at the 41 different academic training centers and make sure that they're all doing the right thing. Not everybody needs to do the same thing, but they need to make sure that your law enforcement officer comes out with the tools that are necessary to do their job, to stay safe, to keep the community safe, and to deal with all of the different issues that they're seeing out in the field now. So that's where our recommendations.
Yeah, and I was reading them. You made a nice job of stating it very succinctly. And you said, number one, insufficient time to cover topics critical to the job. 2, academy curriculum, a little bit outdated. 3, the flow of entry-level training has got to be improved. And finally, more time to practice learned skills. All seem to me to make a lot of very common sense recommendations. When we come back, we're going to talk about how officers' ongoing training can be better targeted to improve police performance. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. Police are required to complete a minimum of 24 hours of training every 2 years. In fact, most police officers do 4 times that amount. But is all this training resulting in better law enforcement? We're talking with Janna Sidley. She's with the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission that recently issued a report on police training in California. So, Janna, I wanted to ask you, you note in your report that, quote, police training needs vary, but requirements are one size fits all, unquote. That doesn't sound like a compliment. Can you elaborate?
Well, yes, what we determined is that exactly what you've pointed out, Mark, is that everybody has the same basic requirements. And the problem, of course, with that is not every police force is dealing with the same issues. You certainly have different issues that you have in Los Angeles than Bakersfield. So we determined that there's a lack of data to help guide law enforcement to get the proper training for each and every individual law enforcement department. That doesn't mean that there aren't basics that everyone needs, but there's also more and different training that's required for different law enforcement departments.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned, I was reading a report that says that the structured training scheme is problematic because new concepts may not reach veteran officers. Why take a refresher course if you've already mastered the skills? And some courses are taken even if the officer is now doing some kind of specialized duty. They need different kind of training. The other thing you mentioned in your report is that training opportunities are not equally available to all departments and officers, and that training availability is often determined by department size and resources. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. What we found speaking to various police chiefs, of course, some departments just don't have the money, and understand it's extremely expensive to train officers properly. Not only are they, is the training itself expensive, but you also lose the officer for being on the street and doing what's required for the city, county, whoever they work for, and they often don't have other officers to backfill. So to send somebody for 3 weeks of training is a huge loss to certain departments and things that they cannot afford. And so that has to be addressed as well.
I think you make a really good point there. I think that people miss sometimes is, if you send someone out to training, someone's got to take their place. And some of these small departments, there is nobody else to take their place. And so they then lose the opportunity to get training. What in the commission's opinion needs to be done, do you think, to improve police officer training during their careers?
I think what's necessary, again, based on data and research from various academics, we need to see different training for officers as they go through their career, and we need to provide different courses for officers depending on what they're actually working on. Not everybody needs to continue with driver training. Not everybody needs to continue with particular weapons training. I think what we're seeing and what's missing is how to de-escalate certain issues. And we're certainly seeing a lack of behavioral training in law enforcement training. So going back to things that we've discussed earlier, stress versus non-stress, I think that what we're seeing through the data is that we're outdated, and we need to address the issues that are happening today in today's society.
Yeah, and you also had some interesting recommendations. You're talking about, improved training intervals with a second academy experience. You're talking about establishing lifelong learning pathways, expanding online learning, which, these days with everything, with Zoom and everything, it allows people to access this information a lot easier than having to drive somewhere to get the training. You're talking about creating testing and evaluation materials that support education, and then also sending post instructors actually to the departments as opposed to the officers going to them. So all really interesting points. And I want to ask you one last question here, and that is, what is the commission recommending when it comes to post in terms of bolstering ongoing training and better support for police officers? What should post be doing?
Well, Post needs to be leading the charge in looking at the data and looking at what classes they are certifying, what classes are not even offered. We recommended, the Little Hoover Commission recommended, that we actually change and add maybe a few more people to the Post board to provide some other ideas and viewpoints. We did not make a specific recommendation about who to add or how many specific people. We're leaving that to the legislature and the experts, but we do think that there needs to be more voices in Post in general. And
I want to follow up on that in the next segment. So up next, we're going to talk about this Commission on Police Officer Standards and Training, or POST, this organization that sets police training standards statewide. What can be done to make it more efficient and effective? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. The California Commission on Police Officer Standards and Training, or POST, was created in 1959 and is an 18-member body comprised primarily of law enforcement members. Is it due for an overhaul? We're talking with Janna Sidley. She's with the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission, and she recently chaired a subcommittee that issued a report on police training in California. So what can you tell us about the current makeup of the POST Commission?
So, Mark, thank you. We, it's very important to have law enforcement involved in law enforcement training. But the Little Hoover Commission did see a need for expanding and maybe adding some new viewpoints and new thoughts into post as we look into expanding training for law enforcement and making it a little bit more responsive to the needs of the community for today's policing.
Yeah, and one of the things I was noticing was that of these, so the breakdown, and actually the report, I didn't expect you to memorize. I actually wrote it down because it's so hard to remember. You have 5 rank and file police officers, 5 city and county elected officials, 2 public members. I'm doing this right. No, I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. It's county sheriffs and police chiefs 5, rank and file police officers 5, city and county elected officials 2, public members 4, educators 1, and then also the California Attorney General. And about 75% have law enforcement experience background, which does make sense, for a training group. I understand why you'd want to have people with that law enforcement background. That certainly makes sense. But what is the downside of having 75% of the post commission have law enforcement in their makeup and their background?
I think what you're missing is other voices and other views, and that's what the Little Hoover Commission is suggesting when we talk about adding additional people to post, is to bring in those new viewpoints, to bring in the community voices that are not being heard or not being loud enough to maybe suggest the proper training for some law enforcement.
So you're talking about people like, with mental health experience or health experience, social service professionals, maybe people who have training in education, a broader group.
That's exactly what we have suggested. We did not tell the legislature nor post how many people, nor did we say exactly who, but those are the types of people that we do suggest should be added to post.
What do you think the political will is for the legislature and the governor to sign off on these changes? Do you think it's there?
I do think it's there. I do think that we obviously need to make some changes. You're seeing some awful policing in certain situations. I want to make sure that you understand that the Little Hoover Commission is very supportive of policing, and we are very supportive of the people who go out there and risk their life every day. And what we want to do is make sure that they have the proper tools to do their job efficiently and safely. And so that was where and how we brought this study to fruition.
Well, nothing is free. And we were talking about resources earlier. This is going to cost some money. Is that going to be an impediment? I mean, anything is a good idea if you can afford it, but can cities in the state afford this training, or is it they can't afford not to do the training?
I think they can't afford not to do it. Exactly. I think that they will find either through state funding, where the state helps with some of this training, or different methods through grant programs. But we can't afford to not train our officers properly. We can't afford to put them out in the streets and have them risk their lives, and we can't afford a community to not be policed properly and to see the horrible situations that we've seen recently in the news.
Now, I'm just wondering if the police unions or the police officers might be a little bit of a roadblock or hesitant to do this, because in some ways they might view it as an indictment that they somehow aren't doing a good job, or perhaps it underscores that, a liability concern that if they're addressing this training, it kind of implies that there's a problem here. Has that been an issue at all?
There probably are some who will feel that, but at the end of the day, I think, and why I stress so much that the Little Hoover Commission has unbelievable support for those men and women who go out every single day and risk their lives on behalf of the other members of the community. And that is the vein at which we bring this. This is not an indictment on police officers. This is to support them and to move forward in a changing environment and make sure that they have the tools every single day to do their job successfully. And so, it needs to be stressed that this is not to say that you've done something wrong. This is to say you need to be better.
Yeah, and I think kind of to wrap it up, the final point is these are professionals, and like any professional, doctor, lawyer, police officer, you need ongoing training. I want to thank Janna Sidley from the Little Hoover Commission for joining us, and I want to thank you for joining us. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.